Welcome to the Listen and Sleep channel. The channel shares good, meaningful books that you should listen to before falling asleep. In today's video, we start with Part 2 of the Deep Work book. Part 2 of the Rules. Rule 1 Deep Work. Not long after David Dwayne and I shared a round at the DuPont Circle Bar, he came up with the idea for the eudaimonia machine. Dwayne is an architecture professor, so he enjoys exploring the intersection of the abstract and the real. The eudaimonia machine is a prime example of this intersection. The machine, named after the ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, turned out to be a building. David explained, "The purpose of the machine is to create an environment in which users can enter a deep, euphoric state of human being to do work at the highest possible level within their individual capacities. In other words, it's a space designed with the sole purpose of enabling the deepest possible work." As you can imagine, I was captivated by this idea. Dwayne held a sketch of the layout of the machine on paper and explained it to me. It's a narrow, one-story rectangular building with 5 rooms arranged in a linear sequence. There are no shared hallways. You must pass through one room to reach the next. As Dwayne explained, the lack of circulation is very important because it prevents you from skipping any space when you delve deeper into the machine. The first room you enter is called the gallery. According to Dwayne's plan, this room would showcase examples of deep work to inspire the machine's users, fostering a culture of healthy pressure and peer accountability. Leaving the gallery, you'd step into the lounge. Here, Dwayne envisioned a high-end cafe and a fully stocked bar, as well as several couches and Wi-Fi. The lounge is designed to create a mood suspended between curiosity and intense debate. This is where you would discuss, ruminate on ideas that you'd later develop more deeply in the machine. Beyond the lounge, you would move into the library. This room stores permanent records of every piece of work done in the machine, as well as books and other resources used to create the work. Dwayne would place a photocopier and scanner there to gather and compile the information you need for your projects. He described the library as the hard drive of the machine. Next is the office area, which includes a standard meeting room with a whiteboard and several smaller workstations. Dwayne explained, "The office is for low-intensity work. In other words, this is the space for completing the superficial tasks that any project requires." Dwayne envisioned an administrator at a desk in the office, helping users optimize their habits for peak performance. Finally, we arrive at the last room of the machine, the deep work room, a term Dwayne borrowed from my reports on the subject. Each room is about 2 meters high and 3 meters wide, surrounded by very thick soundproof walls. Dwayne planned for soundproofing about 5.5 meters thick. He explained, "The deep work room would allow us to focus intensely and keep workflows uninterrupted." He envisioned a deep work cycle lasting 90 minutes, followed by a 90-minute break, repeating 2 or 3 times. That's when your brain reaches its daily focus limit. At this point, the eudaimonia machine only exists in architectural drawings, but even in its conceptual form, its potential to support impactful work excites Dwayne. He told me, "In my mind, this design is still the most interesting architectural masterpiece I've ever created." In an ideal world, where we recognize and realize the true value of deep work, we would all have access to something akin to the eudaimonia machine. While it's not necessary to exactly replicate David Dwayne's design, generally, such a work environment and culture would help us unlock the greatest value from our minds. Unfortunately, this vision is still far from our present reality. Instead, we find ourselves in open offices that are full of distractions, where we can't ignore our inboxes, and meetings happen continuously, all while colleagues expect us to respond to their latest emails quickly rather than focus on producing our best possible work. In other words, as a reader of this book, you are an advocate for deep work in a shallow world. This rule is also the first of 4 rules in Part 2 of the book, designed to address this conflict. Whether or not you have access to your own eudaimonia machine, the strategies that follow will help you simulate its impact in your distracted work life. They will show you how to transform deep work from a lofty aspiration into a regular and crucial part of your daily schedule. From rule number 2 to rule number 4, The following strategies will help you make the most of deep work by building habits that enhance focus and counter distractions. However, before we move on to these strategies, I want to address a question that may be bothering you. Why do we need to intervene in these matters? In other words, once you've acknowledged the value of deep work, isn't that enough to just get started with it more often? Do we really need something as complex as the eudaimonia machine to remind us of something as simple as the need to focus more often? Unfortunately, when it comes to replacing distractions with focus, the issue is not as simple as it sounds. To understand this more clearly, let's examine one of the primary obstacles to deep focus: the urge to switch attention to something more superficial. Most people recognize that this urge can make it hard to concentrate on more demanding tasks, but they rarely anticipate just how frequent and powerful this urge can be. Consider a study by psychologists Wilhelm Hoffman and Roy Baumeister in 2012, where they equipped 205 adults with pagers that went off at randomly chosen times. This is the sampling method discussed in Part 1. When the pager beeped, the participants were asked to pause briefly and reflect on their current desires or how they had felt in the last 30 minutes, after which they had to answer a series of questions about these desires. After 1 week, the researchers had collected over 7,500 samples. Here's a brief summary of their findings. People struggle with desires throughout the day. As Baumeister summarized in his subsequent book Willpower, co-authored with science writer John Tierney, desire turned out to be the norm, not the exception. Among the top 5 most common desires of the participants, it's no surprise that eating, sleeping, and sex were included. But the top 5 also included desires such as resting from hard work, checking email and social media, surfing the web, listening to music, or watching TV. The pull of the internet and television especially showed that the participants could only restrain themselves from these highly distracting temptations about half of the time. These results are far from promising for the goal of this rule, which is to help you develop a deep work habit. They signal that you may find yourself surrounded by the urge to do anything but deep work all day long. And if you're like the German participants in Hoffman and Baumeister's study, these competing desires will likely dominate. At this point, you might respond by saying that you'll succeed where the participants failed, because you understand the value of deep work, and therefore, you'll have stronger willpower to focus. This is an admirable mindset, but centuries-old research has shown that it doesn't work as effectively as you might think. A vast body of research, particularly in the pioneering work of Roy Baumeister, has demonstrated an important and surprising truth about willpower. If your willpower is limited, it quickly runs out the more you use it. In other words, willpower is not a personality trait you can express endlessly without consequence. Instead, it's like a muscle that needs rest. This is why the participants in Hoffman and Baumeister's study often had to struggle intensely with their desires. The distractions gradually depleted their limited supply of willpower until they could no longer resist. You will face the same situation, no matter what you're working on, unless you become tough with your own habits. This insight leads me to the motivating idea behind these strategies. The key to developing a deep work habit is to aim for meaningful goals, incorporating routines and rituals into your work that reduce the amount of willpower needed, thus enabling you to transition into and maintain deep, uninterrupted focus. For instance, if during the afternoon you're tempted to waste time surfing the web and suddenly decide you must switch your attention to a cognitively demanding task, you'll need a lot of willpower to pull your attention away from those websites. Therefore, these efforts will often fail. On the other hand, if you implement smart routines and rituals, such as setting a specific time and place to work on deep tasks every afternoon, you won't need much willpower to begin and sustain that level of focus. Over time, you'll more frequently succeed at deep work. With this in mind, the next 6 strategies are considered a repertoire of habits and rituals based on the science of limited willpower, aimed at maximizing the amount of deep work you can accomplish in your schedule. For other issues, you need to develop a specific model to schedule this type of work and create rituals that increase focus before you begin. Some of the strategies below will implement simple experimental methods designed to tap into the brain's motivational centers, while others will deplete willpower as quickly as possible. You can only try to make deep work your top priority. The personal development strategies outlined below will significantly increase the likelihood of success in making deep work an important part of your career. Philosophical decisions about deep focusability. Donald Knuth, the famous computer scientist, places a strong emphasis on deep work. On his website, he explains, "The work I do often involves hours of sustained research and focus." A graduate student named Brian Chappell, a father with a full-time job, also values deep work, as it is the only way he can complete his thesis with limited time. Chappell shared with me that the moment he discovered deep work was an emotional one. I mention these examples because, although Knuth and Chappell both agree on the importance of deep focus, they differ in their philosophies about how to integrate deep work with their schedules. As I will explain in detail in the next section, Knuth applies a stringent approach, prioritizing deep work by trying to eliminate or minimize all other types of work. In contrast, Chappell adopts a more rhythmic strategy, setting aside a few hours every morning from 5 to 7:30 a.m. to do deep work without exceptions, before starting a day filled with distractions. Both approaches are effective, but they are not universally applicable. Knuth's approach may work well for strategists, but if Chappell were to avoid all shallow work, he might lose his job. You need to have your own philosophy for applying the deep work process to your tasks. As argued in the introduction to this ritual, trying to schedule deep work is not an efficient way to manage limited willpower. However, this example emphasizes that you must carefully select a philosophy that fits your circumstances, because the wrong choice could undermine your deep work habit before it has a chance to take effect. This strategy will help you avoid that by presenting 4 different philosophies of deep work that I've seen work well in practice. The goal is to convince you that there are many different ways to integrate deep work into your schedule, and you should take the time to find the method that works best for you. The stringent philosophy for scheduling deep work. Let's return to Donald Knuth's example. He is well known for his numerous innovations in the field of computer science, particularly for developing highly accurate methods for algorithm performance analysis. Knuth applies this approach to his electronic media as well. If you visit Knuth's website at Stanford with the intention of finding his email address, you'll encounter this note. "I became a happy person on January 1st, 1990, when I stopped using email. I had used email continuously since 1975, and 15 years of email was quite enough for one lifetime. Email is a wonderful tool for those in important roles, but I am not in such a role. My role is insignificant. The work I do often requires hours of sustained research and focus." Knuth goes on to acknowledge that he doesn't intend to completely withdraw from the world. He notes that writing books requires him to correspond with thousands of people, and he still wants to interact with questions and comments. So, what solution does he choose? He provides a postal address, stating that his assistant will sort the incoming letters and filter out those that seem relevant. If something truly urgent arises, the assistant will immediately bring the letter to Knuth, and the remaining letters will be dealt with in bulk every 3 months. Knuth has adopted what I call the stringent philosophy for scheduling deep work. This philosophy maximizes deep work efforts by eliminating or drastically minimizing shallow obligations. People who follow this philosophy tend to pursue a clearly defined and high-value professional goal, and much of their success stems from applying this strategy effectively. It is this sense of relaxation that allows them to eliminate the encroachment of shallow concerns that threaten to overrun the truly valuable activities in today's busy world. For example, Knuth explains his work goals as follows. "I have worked hard to learn certain areas of computer science. Then I try to absorb that knowledge into a form that people who don't have time for research can understand." It would be pointless to try to convince Knuth about the intangible benefits of having more followers on Twitter or the opportunities that might arise from being more freely available by email, because these behaviors do not directly support his goal of mastering specific areas of computer science and then writing that knowledge in an understandable way. Another person who is deeply committed to deep work under the stringent philosophy is Neal Stephenson, the famous science fiction author. If you visit Stephenson's author website, you won't find an email address or postal address. We can better understand this absence through 2 essays Stephenson published in the early days of his website, hosted on the Well in the early 2000s, which are archived on the Internet Archive. In one essay, dated 2003, Stevenson summarized his media policy as follows. People who want to interfere with my focus are politely asked not to, and I make it clear that I don't answer email. To keep important messages in my media policy from getting lost in a sea of lengthy text, I'll make it brief here. All my time and attention speaks for itself. Please don't ask for more. To clarify this policy, Stevenson wrote an essay titled, Why I Am a Bad Correspondent. The crux of his explanation for why it's difficult to contact him is as follows. In other words, the balance of productivity is a non-linear kind of balance. This explains why I'm so bad at correspondence and rarely accept meetings. If I organize my life so that I have long, uninterrupted stretches of time, I can focus on writing novels. But when those stretches are fragmented and interrupted, my productivity at writing novels decreases significantly. This stringent approach, as exemplified by Nuth and Stevenson, is based on the idea that maximizing deep work requires making significant sacrifices in terms of shallow work and distractions. By minimizing or completely eliminating less essential obligations, these individuals create the space they need for sustained focus on their most important and valuable work. Stevenson realized that these two options were mutually exclusive. He could either write great novels regularly, or he could respond to a large number of personal emails and attend conferences, but the result would be slower, lower-quality novels. He chose the first option, and to do so, he had to avoid as much as possible the trivialities associated with work. This issue was so important to Stevenson that he continued to explore its impacts, both positive and negative. In his 2008 science fiction novel Anthem, the book presented a world where an intellectual elite lives in a strict order, isolated from technology and distractions, focusing only on deep thought. In my experience, the strict philosophy tends to make many intellectual workers conservative. Determining their value to the world evokes the sadness of those who have contributed to the information economy, making things even more complicated. Of course, it should be noted that more complicated does not mean less. For instance, a senior manager can play a key role in a multi-billion-dollar company, even if the results they produce are not as tangible or complete as a novel, and yet say, "This is what I've created this year." Therefore, the pond of individuals adhering to the strict philosophy always has limits, and that's okay. If you are outside of that pond, the simplicity of its basic foundation should not represent too much desire. On the other hand, if you are in that pond, someone who makes clear, personalized contributions to the world, carefully consider this life philosophy, as it could be the deciding factor between a mediocre career and a career that will be remembered. I am not entirely sure about the term personalized here. The strict philosophy is not only applied to those who work independently. There are many examples of deep efforts in small groups, such as composing teams like Rogers and Hammerstein or inventing teams like the Wright brothers. What I really mean by this term is that this philosophy fits well with those who can work toward clear goals without having to follow other obligations when they are members of a larger organization. The dual method philosophy of deep work scheduling. The book begins with the story of revolutionary psychologist and thinker Carl Jung. In the 1920s, when Jung was trying to break free from the shadow of his mentor Sigmund Freud, he began regularly visiting a modest stone house he built himself in the woods outside the small town of Bollingen. Every morning, he would lock himself in his room to write without any interruptions. Then, he would meditate and take walks in the forest to think more clearly in preparation for the next day's writing. In my view, these efforts aimed to enhance his deep work abilities to the extent that helped Jung succeed in the intellectual battle with Freud and Freudian followers. When recounting this story, I want to emphasize an important point. Dr. Jung did not apply a strict approach to deep work. In the two examples above, Donald Knuth and Neil Stevenson tried to eliminate distractions and trivialities entirely from their work. Jung, on the other hand, aimed to eliminate them only during his time in solitude. For the rest of his time in Zurich, his life was free-spirited and not strict. Jung was busy treating patients, constantly occupied, often staying in the hospital until late at night. He actively participated in the coffee culture of Zurich, and he conducted and attended lectures at prestigious universities there. Einstein even received a doctorate from a university in Zurich and later taught elsewhere. He also knew Jung, and the two had dinner together several times to discuss key ideas in Einstein's theory of special relativity. In other words, Jung's life in Zurich closely resembles the modern-day intellectual worker of the hyperconnected digital age. We could substitute Zurich with San Francisco and letters with tweets, and discuss some brilliant tech CEOs. I call Jung's approach the dual method philosophy of deep work. This philosophy requires you to split your time according to certain clear rules to pursue deep work, while leaving the rest of your time for other tasks. During the deep work phase, those following the dual method philosophy follow strict focus, striving for maximum concentration and flow. During the trivial work phase, focus is no longer the primary priority. The division of time between deep work and trivial tasks can be applied on various scales. For example, on a weekly scale, you could dedicate the last 4 days of the week to deep work and use the remaining time freely. Similarly, on a yearly scale, you might dedicate one season to most of your deep work, as many academics do during the summer or during a sabbatical. The dual method philosophy believes that deep work can achieve maximum productivity, but only when the practitioner devotes enough time and effort to reach the highest level of cognitive engagement, the state where real breakthroughs occur. This is why the minimum time unit for deep work in this philosophy is often at least a full day. At the same time, the dual method philosophy is often employed by those who would not succeed if they didn't complete tasks considered trivial. For instance, Jung needed to conduct clinical consultations to earn money to pay the bills, and to sit at coffee houses in Zurich to stimulate his thinking. The approach of alternating between the two methods suits both of these needs well. To explore a more modern example of the dual method philosophy in practice, we can return to the case of Adam Grant, a professor at Wharton School of Business, who carefully considers the work habits I introduced earlier in Part 1. As you may know, Grant's schedule during his fast-track promotion to professor at Wharton is a textbook example of dual method scheduling. On an academic year scale, he arranges his teaching courses into one semester so that he can focus on deep work during the other semester. During his deep work periods, he applies the dual method approach on a weekly basis. 1 or 2 times per month, he will set aside 2 to 4 days for strict focus. Grant will close his door, set up an auto-reply for his email, and immerse himself in research without interruption. Outside of these deep work periods, Grant is known to be very open and approachable. His best-selling book, Give and Take, 2013, encourages using one's time and attention without expecting reciprocity as a strategy for advancing in a career. Those who follow the dual method philosophy of deep work greatly admire the productivity of those who follow a strict philosophy, but they also value the benefits they gain from engaging in trivial work behaviors. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to implementing this philosophy is that even short periods of deep work require a flexibility that many people still fear they lack in their current jobs. If just 1 hour of not checking your inbox makes you feel uneasy, then the idea of disappearing for a day or more may seem unfeasible. But I suspect that the dual method approach actually suits more types of work than you might think. For example, I previously described the research by Professor Leslie Perlow from Harvard Business School. In this study, a group of management consultants were asked to take 1 day off every week to disconnect entirely. The consultants were initially worried that clients would relentlessly pursue them, but it turned out the clients didn't mind at all. Just like the cases of Jung, Grant, and Perlow, people generally respect your right to disconnect if these periods are clearly defined and carefully communicated, as long as, outside of those times, they can easily reach you. The rhythm method in planning deep work. When Seinfeld first launched his show, Jerry Seinfeld still maintained his work as a stand-up comedian with a busy performance schedule. At that time, writer and comedian Brad Isaac, who was still performing at comedy clubs, happened to meet Seinfeld at a club while waiting to go on stage. Isaac explained in an article, "I saw an opportunity. I asked Seinfeld if he had any advice for a young comedian. What he shared has helped me throughout my life." Seinfeld's advice to Isaac was rooted in very ordinary principles. The way to become a better comic is to write better jokes, and that the way to write better jokes was to write every day. Seinfeld described a special technique he used to maintain this routine. He would hang a calendar on the wall. Every day he wrote a joke. He would mark an X on that day's date on the calendar. Seinfeld said, "After a few days, you'll have a chain. All you have to do is keep it going and watch the chain get longer. You'll love seeing that chain, especially when you've been doing it for a couple of weeks. Then, your only job is to not break the chain." This chain method, as it is called by some, soon became a goal for writers and fitness enthusiasts, people who needed to develop the consistency to accomplish hard tasks. In terms of purpose, this method is a concrete example of a broader approach to achieving deep work in life, the rhythm philosophy. According to this philosophy, the easiest way to start deep work sessions is to make them a simple habit. In other words, our goal is to create a rhythm for the task so that you don't need to spend energy deciding whether to do deep work and when to do it. The chain method is a good example of the rhythm philosophy because it combines a simple planning technique, working every day, with a self-reminder that is quite easy to follow, big red XS on the calendar. Another common method to implement the rhythm philosophy is to replace the visual support of the chain method with a series of necessary time frames for daily deep work. These methods share the common trait that maintaining visual progress indicators can help remove barriers to deep work, even eliminating the need for the simplest planning decisions, such as when to do deep work during the day. Take the example of Brian Chappell, the busy doctor I introduced earlier. Chappell applied the rhythm philosophy in planning deep work beyond what might be necessary. During the time he focused on writing his dissertation, he was offered a full-time position at a center within the campus where he had studied. In terms of work, this was a great opportunity, and Chappell happily accepted the job. But academically, a full-time job, especially with the expectation of welcoming his first child, would make it hard for Chappell to focus deeply enough to write his dissertation. Chappell began by trying to force himself to focus deeply. He created a ritual. Deep work should take place in 90-minute intervals because he realized it took time to get into a focused state, and he tried to schedule this time to fit with his overall plan. Unsurprisingly, this strategy proved effective. In a dissertation kickoff program that Chappell attended last year, he was able to write a full chapter in just 1 week of serious deep work. After taking the full-time job, he managed to write another chapter in his first year of work. The writing process that year drove Chappell to adopt the rhythm philosophy. He set a rule to wake up and begin work at 5:30 a.m. He would then work until 7:30 a.m., have breakfast, and go to his job to fulfill his daily obligations. After going through the initial phase, he quickly moved his wake-up time to 4:45 a.m. to intensify his deep focus in the mornings. When I interviewed Chappell for this book, he described his rhythm method approach to deep work planning as high productivity and no guilt. He set a goal to write 4 to 5 pages a day and could outline chapters of his dissertation at a rate of 2 to 3 weeks per chapter, an extraordinary productivity for someone working full-time. He concluded, "Who says I can't be that productive? Why not me?" The rhythm philosophy offers an interesting contrast to the dual method philosophy. Those who follow the rhythm philosophy may not achieve the intense depth of thought that those following the dual method philosophy often seek in long, focused periods. However, in exchange, this approach is more in tune with human nature. By supporting deep work through solid, consistent habits that you can more or less accomplish regularly, the rhythm philosophy often helps you accumulate more deep work hours each year. The journalist philosophy in deep work planning. You can choose between the rhythmic method and the method that sometimes encounters planning issues. If you were Carl Jung, participating in a debate about knowledge with supporters of Sigmund Freud, you would likely recognize the importance of finding time to focus on your ideas. On the other hand, if you're writing a scientific paper without pressure to finish it, the very nature of the rhythmic philosophy might be what you need to maintain progress. However, for many people, it is not only about their biased self-control towards the rhythmic philosophy, but also the reality that some jobs will not allow you to take a few days off when deep focus is necessary. For many bosses, you can be free to focus as much as you want, as long as you respond to the boss's emails in a timely manner. This might be the biggest reason why the rhythmic philosophy is one of the most popular approaches for people who do both deep work and standard office tasks. The journalist philosophy in deep work planning. In the 1980s, when Walter Isaacson was just in his early 30s, he had a rapidly rising career through his work at Time magazine. By then, he had clearly grasped the mindset of the intellectual class. For instance, Christopher Hitchens, a fellow writer at London Review of Books, called him one of America's finest journalists. It was time for Isaacson to begin writing his big, important book, a necessary step in his journalistic achievements. So, he chose a complex subject, a narrative biography of 6 key figures in early Cold War politics, and worked with a young editor at Time, Evan Thomas, to write a moderately thick book, an 864-page epic titled The Wise Men, 6 Friends and the World They Made. This book, published in 1986, was enthusiastically received by readers. The New York Times called it a work with rich composition, and the San Francisco Chronicle praised the 2 young writers for creating the Plutarch of the Cold War era. Less than a decade later, Isaacson reached the peak of his career when he was appointed editor of Time, later becoming CEO of a policy institute and a renowned biographer of historical figures such as Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and Steve Jobs. However, what interests me about Isaacson is not what he accomplished with his first book, but how he wrote it. When I looked into the story, I stumbled upon a personal connection. It turns out that, during the time Isaacson was preparing to publish The Wise Men, my uncle, John Paul Newport, also a journalist in New York at the time, had rented a beach house with Isaacson. To this day, my uncle still remembers Isaacson's impressive work habits. It was surprising. While we were sitting outside enjoying the breeze or doing other things, Isaacson would go back to his bedroom for a while to continue writing the book. For about 20 minutes to an hour, we would hear the sound of the typewriter, and then he would come down and relax with everyone. It was as though work had never been stressful for him. He just happily worked whenever he had some free time. Isaacson worked according to the method of, whenever he had free time, he would dive into his deep work and focus on his book. It turns out that this is how one can write a 900-page book while still spending most of their time being one of the best journalists in America. I call this method the journalist philosophy, a method that allows you to engage in deep work wherever you can fit it into your schedule. The name comes from the fact that journalists like Walter Isaacson are trained to be able to write at any time due to the nature of their profession. This approach is not for those who are new to deep work. As I stated in the introduction to the rules, the ability to switch your mind quickly from shallow work to deep work is not natural. Without practice, this transition can drain your limited energy. This habit also requires self-confidence, believing that what you're doing is important and that it will lead to success. This confidence is typically built on a foundation of past career achievements. For example, Isaacson likely didn't take long to become a writer compared to new novelists, because he had always worked hard to be a respected writer in his field. He knew his ability to write biographies was valuable, and that it was an important task for his career development. This confidence was a companion throughout his self-motivation process. I support the journalist philosophy in deep work because it's the method I use when striving to achieve my own goals. In other words, I'm not someone who adheres to the rigorous deep work philosophy, though sometimes I envy the complete disengagement of computer scientist Donald Knuth. I also don't plan to engage in deep work for many days like those who follow the bimodal approach. And although I'm enthusiastic about the rhythmic philosophy, my schedule doesn't allow for a consistent, daily routine. Instead, I prefer to be like Isaacson, facing my work every week and doing my best to engage in deep work whenever possible. For example, to write this book, I have to seize any free time I can. When the kids are asleep, I grab my laptop and lock myself in my home office. If my wife wants to visit her parents in Annapolis for the weekend, I take advantage of having extra help with the kids to find a quiet corner at home and write. If there's a canceled company meeting or an afternoon with no work scheduled, I might head to one of my favorite libraries on campus to write more, and so on. I must admit, I don't strictly follow the journalist philosophy. For instance, I don't decide to do deep work on the spot. Instead, at the beginning of the week, I designate specific times for deep work and review these decisions at the start of each day. If necessary, see rule number 4 for more details on my planning habits. By reducing the need to decide when to do deep work, I can save more energy for deep thinking. Overall, the journalist philosophy in deep work planning is difficult to implement. But if you are confident in the value of what you are trying to create, and you carry out the work with the skill of deep focus, a skill we will continue to develop through the strategies in the next sections, you can accomplish a large volume of deep work even when facing a tight schedule. Here is the English translation of the passage you provided. The ritualization process. When we talk about knowledge workers, we often forget one thing. They are rarely careless about their work habits. Let's take the case of Robert Caro, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer. According to a 2009 magazine article, every tiny corner of his office in New York is meticulously organized. The placement of books, the arrangement of notebooks, the items hanging on the walls, even the clothing he wears to the office. Everything is designated according to a routine that changes very rarely throughout Caro's long career. Explaining this, he said, "I have trained myself to be organized." Charles Darwin also had a similarly strict routine during the time he was working on The Origin of Species. According to his son, Francis, Darwin would wake up at 7 a.m. to take a short walk. Then, he would have breakfast alone and begin his research from 8 to 9:30 a.m. He would spend the next hour reading letters that had arrived the day before, and then return to his research from 10:30 until noon. Afterward, he would contemplate difficult ideas while strolling along a deserted path around his house. He would walk until he was satisfied with his thoughts before ending his workday. Journalist Mason Curry, who spent half a decade studying the habits of famous thinkers and writers, summarized this systematization trend as follows. There is a common belief that artists work purely by inspiration. They know where to find a spark, a flash of insight, or a burst of creativity. But I hope my work can prove that waiting for inspiration is a terrible plan. In fact, the best advice I can give anyone trying to do creative work is to forget about inspiration. In a column for the New York Times on this topic, David Brooks bluntly summarized this reality. Great creative minds think like an artist and work like an accountant. This strategy suggests much. To make the most of deep work sessions, create strict rituals that reflect the methods of the great thinkers mentioned above. There's a reason for this imitation. Great minds like Caro and Darwin didn't perform quirky rituals. Their success depended on deep, repeated focus. There's no way to win a Pulitzer or form a great theory without pushing your brain to its limits. Rituals help them minimize obstacles in shifting to a deep focus mode, allowing them to easily concentrate and maintain this state for longer periods. If they had waited for inspiration to strike before getting serious about work, their achievements would have been far less impressive. There is no universal ritual for deep work. What works depends on the person and the type of plan they follow. However, any effective ritual should answer the following questions. 1. Where and for how long will you work? You need a familiar place to do deep work. This could be your office, with the door closed and no interruptions. One of my colleagues likes to put a "Do Not Disturb" sign outside his office when tackling a difficult problem. If you can identify a space that's reserved exclusively for deep work, such as a meeting room or a quiet library, the results can be much more positive. Wherever you work, make sure to dedicate a specific time frame to maintain your focus on deep work. 2. How will you approach your work once you start? Rituals require rules and processes that turn the habit into a framework. For example, you might impose a ban on using the internet, or set a goal like writing a certain number of words every 20 minutes to sharpen your focus. Without this structure, you will struggle mentally between what you should and shouldn't do during deep work, constantly trying to evaluate whether you're working hard enough. These are unnecessary tasks that drain your energy. 3. How will you support your work? Your ritual should include necessary support to maintain the brain's high-intensity focus. For example, you might establish a fixed ritual, such as starting your work with a good cup of coffee, eating enough to maintain your energy, or adding light exercises like walking to clear your mind. As Nietzsche put it, only ideas that arise from walking have value. This support can also include objective factors like organizing your work to minimize energy-draining distractions, as we saw in Caro's example. To maximize success, you need to strengthen your efforts while working deeply. At the same time, This support needs to be systematized so that you don't waste mental energy figuring out what you need at the moment. These questions will help you begin to build your deep work ritual. But keep in mind that finding the right rituals to stick to may require experimentation, so be prepared for that. I assure you that the effort is worthwhile. When you do what feels right to you, the impact can be huge. Don't underestimate the value of deep work. Alongside efforts involving complex rituals, which may seem strange to the outside world, creating a framework for your mind and pushing it into a focus state will help you start generating meaningful results. Making the task significant. In early winter of 2007, J.K. Rowling, who was under intense pressure to finish The Deathly Hallows, the final book in her Harry Potter series, found herself struggling to maintain focus at her home office in Edinburgh, Scotland. The book had to tie in with the previous 6 books, and she had to satisfy the expectations of millions of fans. Rowling needed to engage in deep work to meet these demands, but she found that her focus was increasingly interrupted while working at home. Rowling shared in an interview, "When I was writing Deathly Hallows, it was a day with the windows wide open. The kids were at home, and the dogs were barking." Realizing this was too simple, J.K. Rowling decided to take extreme action to shift her mindset. She rented a luxury room at the 5-star Balmoral Hotel in downtown Edinburgh. She explained, "I went to this hotel because it was beautiful, but I didn't intend to stay there. But on the first day, my writing went quite smoothly, so I kept returning, and I ended up finishing the last Harry Potter book there." In hindsight, it's no surprise that Rowling stayed at the hotel until the book was finished. This was a perfect arrangement for her plan. The Balmoral is famous for being one of the most luxurious hotels in Scotland, a grand Victorian-style building with intricate stonework and a very tall clock tower. It's just a few buildings away from Edinburgh Castle, one of Rowling's inspirations for creating Hogwarts. Rowling's decision to go to a luxury hotel near Edinburgh Castle is an example of a curious yet effective deep work strategy, making the task significant. The concept is simple. By fundamentally altering your usual environment and investing significant money or effort to support deep work, you elevate the importance of the task. This elevation helps reduce procrastination instincts and generates motivation and working energy, making the task significant. For example, writing a chapter in the Harry Potter series is a challenging and mentally taxing task, regardless of where you do it. However, when you have to pay over $1,000 a day to complete that chapter in a luxurious hotel room, built in the same style as Hogwarts, the effort required to start and maintain focus will be much easier compared to sitting in your home office, where distractions abound. When researching the habits of other famous deep workers, you'll likely encounter the strategy of making the task significant. For instance, during his time as CEO of Microsoft, Bill Gates became well known for conducting his Think Weeks. During these periods, he would leave behind his usual work and family to retreat to a room full of papers and books. The goal was to think deeply and coherently about the big issues facing the company. It was during these weeks that he concluded that the internet would play a key role in the future of information technology. Nothing could disrupt his deep thinking in his Seattle office at Microsoft headquarters, but the unusual shift of spending an entire week isolated allowed him to reach the level of focus he sought. Alan Lightman, a physicist from MIT and an award-winning novelist, also applies the strategy of making the task significant. Every summer, he retreats to a small island off the coast of Maine to engage in deep thinking and recharge. In 2000, he described this action in an interview. The island not only lacked internet access, but even phone service. He stated, "In just 2.5 months, I feel like I've found a stillness in my life, something that's very hard to find." Not everyone has the freedom to spend 2 months in Maine, but many writers, including Dan Pink and Michael Pollan, experience a similar sense of focus year-round by building dedicated spaces for writing, spaces that often require considerable time and investment. For instance, Pollan even wrote a book about his experience building a house in the woods behind his old house in Connecticut. Writers don't necessarily need extravagant houses. They just need a laptop and a quiet place to work. The value of these spaces isn't the amenities. Rather, It's the act of making the task significant by designing and constructing the space with one sole goal: to focus on writing more effectively. You don't always need to make the task significant. The physicist William Shockley, who worked for Bell Labs, made significant contributions when he invented the transistor. I will detail this in the next strategy, when two members of his team made a breakthrough while Shockley was away on another project. Shockley had locked himself in a hotel room in Chicago, where he was attending a conference. He was determined not to leave the room until he had organized all his thoughts. When he finally left the room, he sent his notes to Murray Hill in New Jersey so his colleagues could paste them into the experiment notebooks and mark the breakthrough. The transistor connection Shockley discovered through his deep focus ultimately won him the Nobel Prize. Another example of making the task significant is the story of Peter Shankman, an entrepreneur and pioneer in social media. As a famous speaker, Shankman spends much of his time on flights. Eventually, he realized that the altitude of over 30,000 feet was the ideal environment for concentration. This came to light one time when he realized he had signed a book deal and only had 2 weeks to complete the manuscript. Shankman needed an extraordinary level of focus to meet the deadline. To achieve this state, he did something unusual. He booked a business-class round-trip ticket to Tokyo. He wrote throughout the flight to Japan, had an espresso in the business-class lounge upon arrival, and then wrote again on the return flight to the U.S. Just 30 hours after leaving, he had a completed manuscript in hand. He explained, "The trip cost $4,000, but it was a trip worth making." In all the examples above, it's not just a change in environment or the search for tranquility that allows you to work deeply. The key factor is the serious mental commitment to the task at hand. Placing yourself in a new environment to focus on a writing project, taking a week off to think, or locking yourself in a hotel room until you've completed a critical invention. These actions elevate the importance of the task mentally, helping you draw on the mental resources required. Sometimes, to go deep, you must first go far. Not working alone. The relationship between deep work and collaboration requires subtlety. However, you should still consider this relationship, because if you use it wisely, it can enhance your deep work efforts. Before diving into this topic, let's first revisit a situation that may seem like an unresolved contradiction. In part 1 of this book, I criticized Facebook for the design of their new headquarters. Specifically, I pointed out that the company's goal was to create the largest open office space in the world, a giant room capable of holding 20,800 employees, which poses a serious threat to focus. Research in intuition and physics increasingly emphasizes the fact that sharing workspace with too many colleagues leads to distractions, creating an environment that hinders serious thought. In 2013, Bloomberg Businessweek summarized recent studies on the topic, calling for an end to the tyranny of the open office. However, these open office designs are not implemented without reason. According to a report by Maria Konnikova in The New Yorker, when the concept first emerged, the goal was to facilitate communication and the flow of ideas. This idea resonated with American businesses seeking the startup glow of a non-traditional office style. For example, Josh Tarangiel, the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, explained the absence of offices in Bloomberg's headquarters by saying, "The open office is quite beautiful. It ensures everyone is in sync with the mission and it encourages curiosity among people working in different fields." Jack Dorsey justified the open structure of Square's headquarters by saying, "We encourage people to work in open spaces because we believe in the chance of serendipitous discoveries. People will collaborate and learn new things together." To guide the discussion, let's call this principle: when everyone exchanges new ideas and actively collaborates, the theory of serendipitous creativity. When Mark Zuckerberg decided to build the world's largest office, we can reasonably assume that he based this decision on this theory, as well as the fact that it helped drive many of the open office trends in Silicon Valley and beyond. Other factors, such as cost savings and increased oversight, also played a role, but these were less prominent and less emphasized. The decision to enhance focus or foster serendipity. The decision to focus on increasing concentration or fostering serendipitous discoveries suggests that deep work, personal effort, is incompatible with the creation of creative visions, collaborative effort. However, This conclusion is incomplete. I believe it stems from an insufficient understanding of the theory of serendipitous creativity. To strengthen this argument, let's look at the origins of this particular view of what drives breakthroughs. This theory comes from several sources that remain controversial, and by chance, I happened to come across one of the more famous sources. During my 7 years at MIT, I worked in the iconic Building 20, located at the intersection of Main Street and Vassar Street in eastern Cambridge. The building was eventually demolished in 1998. It had originally been used as a temporary fallout shelter during World War II to prevent radiation from spreading from the Institute's radiation laboratory. According to a 2012 article in The New Yorker, the building was initially considered a failure. The ventilation system was poor, and the hallways were dark. The thin walls and leaky roof made the building hot in summer and freezing in winter. However, after the war, scientists continued to flock to Cambridge. MIT needed more space, so rather than immediately demolishing Building 20 as they had promised to local authorities due to lax building codes, they continued to use it as an expansion space. This led to a mismatch between different departments: the nuclear science department, the linguistics department, and the electrical engineering department, who all shared the building, located next to buildings that had secretly been rented out as machine shops and piano repair facilities. Since Building 20 was constructed cheaply, the teams were free to rearrange the space as needed. Walls and floors could be moved, and equipment was attached to the beams. When Gerald Zacharias created the first atomic clock, the New Yorker article emphasized the importance of removing 2 floors from Building 20's lab so that Zacharias could install the 3-tiered cylinder necessary for his experimental equipment. MIT's unofficial belief was that the random connections between different principles brought together in a building that could be restructured offered opportunities and a creative spirit, leading to breakthroughs and innovations in diverse fields, such as Chomsky's grammar, Loren's navigation radar, and video games. All of these were created during the post-war decades of development. Eventually, when the building was demolished to make room for the $300 million data center designed by Frank Gehry, where I now spend time, the loss was deeply felt. To memorialize the Plywood Palace, the interior design of the Stata Center incorporated unfinished wood panels and exposed concrete that was still under construction. While Building 20 was built hastily, the pursuit of serendipitous creativity was more systematically approached elsewhere, more than 300 kilometers southwest, in Murray Hill, New Jersey. Here, Mervyn Kelly, the director of Bell Labs, oversaw the construction of a new laboratory building designed to encourage interaction by placing many scientists and engineers together in a shared workspace. Kelly rejected the standard university approach of placing departments in separate buildings. Instead, he merged spaces into a contiguous structure with long connecting corridors, some so long that when you stood at one end, you couldn't see the other. Bell Labs secretary, John Gertner, commented on this design. "If you walk the length of the hall, you'll surely encounter many familiar faces, many problems, many jokes and ideas. Everything is almost possible. A physicist on the way to lunch is like a magnet rolling through a pile of scrap metal." This strategy, combined with Kelly's strong recruitment of the world's brightest minds, created one of the most focused innovation environments in modern civilization. Decades after World War II, along with many other achievements, the lab produced the first solar cells, lasers, communication satellites, mobile communication systems, and fiber optic networks. Meanwhile, theorists developed both information theory and coding theory, astronomers won Nobel Prizes with the Big Bang Theory, and most importantly, physicists invented the transistor die. In other words, historical examples seem to validate the theory of serendipitous creativity. We can confidently argue that the transistor required Bell Labs, and it had the ability to bring together world-class semiconductor physicists, quantum theorists, and experimental philosophers into one building where they could meet and learn from one another. This was likely not the invention of a single deep-thinking scientist in a context similar to Carl Jung's Stone Tower. But here, we need more to understand what really fostered innovation at places like Building 20 and Bell Labs. To do that, let's return to my own experience at MIT. When I arrived there as a graduate student in the fall of 2004, I was part of the first cohort to enter the new Stata Center, which replaced Building 20. Since the center had just been established, the new students were given a tour of its various spaces. We knew that Frank Gehry had arranged the offices around a common space and applied open staircases between adjacent floors to encourage the chance encounters that had worked well for previous generations. But what really struck me at the time was a feature that wasn't part of Gehry's original design but was recently added by the department. Special soundproofing pads were installed in the office door frames to enhance acoustic insulation. Professors at MIT, some of the world's top technology innovators, didn't want to work in this kind of open office space. Instead, they needed features that would allow them to work privately. The role of collaboration in deep work. Insights from Building 20 and Bell Labs. These soundproof offices were connected to large common areas, creating a novel architecture in the form of a wheel and spoke model, useful for both serendipitous encounters and focused, deep thinking. It was a dispersed design, where we could find independent thinkers isolated from external inspiration yet undistracted, and at the other extreme, fully collaborative thinkers in an open space, overflowing with inspiration but still able to concentrate on deep thought when necessary. Returning to Building 20 and Bell Labs, we see this type of architecture implemented effectively. Neither building resembled the modern open office design. Instead, they were built according to a traditional layout of separate offices connected by common corridors. The creative technique was interesting in that each office shared a long connecting space, compelling researchers to interact whenever they needed to move from one place to another. Therefore, we can reject the notion that open offices have destroyed the depth of work but do not detract from the spontaneity of creative breakthroughs. The issue is that we must maintain both elements through a wheel and spoke arrangement. Express ideas on the spokes regularly, but maintain the hub for deep work when problems need solving. However, working alone is not always the best strategy. For example, let's look at the invention of the transistor at Bell Labs, previously mentioned. This breakthrough was the result of a large team of researchers, each with their own expertise, who came together to form a semiconductor research group that invented a smaller, more reliable replacement for the vacuum tube. Group discussions were a prerequisite for creating the transistor, a clear example of the usefulness of the spoke behavior. As the research team established the foundational knowledge for this invention, the innovation process shifted to a hub. However, what made this process particularly interesting was that even when it shifted to hub mode, it remained collaborative. There were two separate researchers, experimental philosopher Walter Brattain and quantum theorist John Bardeen, who, in 1947, within just 1 month, made a series of breakthroughs leading to the successful invention of the first semiconductor transistor. Brattain and Bardeen worked together during this time in a small laboratory, side by side, helping each other progress and offering more efficient designs. They mostly engaged in deep work, but a kind of deep work we hadn't seen before. Brattain would focus intensely on creating experimental designs based on Bardeen's latest theoretical insights, and then Bardeen would focus on drawing conclusions from Brattain's latest experiments, trying to expand his theoretical framework to accommodate their observations. This reciprocal support demonstrated a form of collaborative deep work, often common in academic environments, that I call the whiteboard effect. For certain types of problems, exchanging ideas on a whiteboard can actually help you focus more deeply when working alone. The presence of another person, waiting for your new initiative, whether in the room or genuinely wanting to collaborate, can limit your natural instincts to avoid deep work. Now, we can return and draw some practical conclusions about the role of collaboration in deep work. The success of Building 20 and Bell Labs shows that effective deep work does not necessarily mean isolation. Indeed, the cases mentioned earlier suggest that for many types of work, especially during creative processes, collaborative deep work can yield better results. Therefore, this strategy requires careful consideration of the best ways to combine focus with collaboration. If you do so, keep the following 2 guidelines in mind. First, distractions are still a major obstacle to deep focus. Therefore, the wheel and spoke model is an important test. Separate the pursuit of serendipitous encounters from deep thinking efforts, and begin from those sources of inspiration. You should strive to optimize each effort separately, rather than blending them into a chaotic mess that hinders both goals. Second, even when you hide away to focus on deep thinking, don't forget to take advantage of the whiteboard effect if the opportunity arises. When working with others on a problem, both parties can stimulate each other to reach greater depths of focus, leading to more valuable outcomes than when working alone. In other words, consider collaborating with someone when doing deep work if the opportunity arises to take your results to the next level. At the same time, don't overemphasize seeking interaction and positive randomness to the point of becoming fixated on uninterrupted focus. Instead, try to filter out the useful ideas from those around you. Execution principles. This is a story that has become legendary in the business consulting world. In the mid-1990s, Professor Clayton Christensen of Harvard Business School received a call from Andy Grove, CEO and chairman of Intel. Grove had read Christensen's research on disruptive innovation and invited him to fly to California to discuss the implications of this theory for Intel. Upon arrival, Christensen outlined the basics of disruption. Conservative companies are often overtaken unexpectedly by new startups offering low-cost services in the lower market segments, but over time, these companies improve their low-cost offerings just enough to capture the higher-end market share. Grove realized that Intel was facing a similar threat from low-quality processors produced by emerging companies such as AMD and Cyrix. Recognizing the disruptive threat, Grove came up with the strategy to create the Celeron line of processors, a low-end chip series that helped Intel successfully navigate this challenge. However, there is one aspect of the story that few people know. Christensen recalls that during a break in their meeting, Grove asked him, "How do I execute this?" Christensen responded by discussing business strategy and explaining how Grove could set up a new business unit. Grove interrupted him with a terse reply, "You're a naive academic. I asked you how to do it, but you're telling me what I should do. I know what I need to do. I just don't know how to do it." Christensen then explained that the distinction between what to do and how to do it is critical, yet it is often overlooked in business. Defining the strategy necessary to achieve a goal is often straightforward, but the problem is that companies cannot figure out how to actually implement the strategies they have defined. I happened to read this story in the introduction Christensen wrote for the book The 4 Disciplines of Execution, 4DX, which is based on extensive case study research to describe the 4 disciplines, abbreviated as 4DX, that help companies successfully implement high-level strategies. What struck me after reading it was the gap between what needs to be done and how to do it, related to the need for finding more time for deep work. Just as Grove identified the importance of competing in the low-end product market, I recognized the importance of prioritizing depth. What I needed was a way to execute this strategy. Drawn by these parallels, I set myself the goal of adapting the 4DX framework for my own personal work habits and was pleasantly surprised to see how useful it was in driving me toward effective action in implementing deep work. Perhaps these ideas were refined for large companies, but their basic concepts seemed equally applicable when we need to achieve important tasks amidst distractions and interruptions. With that in mind, in the following sections, I'll summarize the 4 principles in the 4DX framework, and for each one, I will describe my own experience in applying them to develop a deep work habit. Principle 1. Focus on the wildly important. The authors of the 4 Disciplines of Execution explain that the more you try to accomplish, the harder it becomes to accomplish anything. They argue that you should focus on a small number of wildly important goals. This simplicity helps an organization concentrate its energy just enough to produce real results. For individuals focused on deep work, the implication here is that you should pursue fewer ambitions in order to make time for deep work. Simply stating, "I need to spend more time in deep work," is not enough to drive motivation. Instead, setting a specific goal can be much more helpful and will create deeper enthusiasm for the work. In a 2014 article titled The Art of Focus, David Brooks supported this approach to ambitious goals aimed at fostering focused behavior, explaining, "If you want to concentrate your attention, don't try to say no to the usual distractions. Try saying yes to what stirs your desire, and let that desire pull everything else along with it." For example, when I first tried applying the 4DX principles, I set a specific and important goal: to publish 5 interesting peer-reviewed papers within the next year. This was an ambitious goal, as the number was higher than anything I had previously published and came with rewards, such as a positive tenure review. Combining these two elements helped motivate me to move toward my goal. Principle 2. Act on the lead measures. Once the wildly important goal is identified, you need to measure your success. In 4DX, there are 2 types of measures: lag measures and lead measures. Lag measures describe what you are trying to improve. For example, if your goal is to increase customer satisfaction at a bakery, the lag measure is customer satisfaction scores. As the authors of 4DX explain, the problem with lag measures is that by the time you receive the measurement, it's too late to change your behavior. By the time you get these results, it's already over. In contrast, lead measures measure the new behaviors that will drive success based on the lag measures. In the example of the bakery, an effective lead measure could be the number of customers receiving free samples. This is a number you can directly increase by offering more samples. As you increase this number, your lag measure, customer satisfaction, will improve. In other words, lead measures focus your attention on behaviors that directly influence the near future and will positively impact your long-term goal. For an individual focusing on deep work, it's easy to identify an appropriate lead measure: time spent in deep work toward the wildly important goal. Returning to my example, this realization had a significant impact on how I guided my academic research. I had previously focused on lag measures, such as the number of papers published each year. However, these measures didn't influence my day-to-day behavior because there was little I could do in the short term to significantly impact this long-term goal. By shifting to tracking deep work hours, these measures became directly relevant to my daily life. Every additional hour spent on deep work would immediately be reflected in my score. Principle 3. Keep a compelling scoreboard. The authors of the 4 disciplines of execution explain, people will change their behavior if they track and measure their score. When trying to motivate a team to achieve the organization's wildly important goal, it is essential to have a public place to record and track their lead measures. This scoreboard creates a sense of competition, keeps everyone focused on the right metrics, and increases motivation. When individuals recognize that their success stems from their lead measures, they will focus their efforts on improving those metrics. In the previous principle, I argued that for individuals focused on deep work, their deep work hours serve as the lead measure. Therefore, the individual's scoreboard must be a visible object in their workspace, displaying their current deep work hours. In my initial experiments with the 4DX framework, I came up with a simple yet effective way to implement this scoreboard. I took a piece of cardboard and divided it into rows, each representing a week of the current semester. I labeled each row with the days of the week and attached it to the side of my computer screen, where I couldn't ignore it. Each week, I tracked the number of hours I dedicated to deep work during that week by simply marking a check on the corresponding row. To maximize the motivation generated by this scoreboard, whenever I reached a milestone, such as solving a tough problem, I would circle the check mark corresponding to the number of hours completed. This served 2 purposes. First, it allowed me to connect cumulative deep work hours with tangible results. Second, it helped recalibrate my expectations regarding the number of deep work hours needed to achieve each result. This reality, even larger than I initially thought, motivated me to engage in more deep work. Principle 4. Create a cadence of accountability. The authors of the 4 disciplines of execution further emphasize that the final step in maintaining focus on lead measures is teams working toward a wildly important goal need to hold regular meetings. In these meetings, team members must review their scoreboard, commit to specific actions that will improve their scores before the next meeting, and present the results of their commitments made in the previous meeting. They note that this evaluation can be summarized in just a few minutes, but it must be done regularly to be effective. The authors argue that this process creates a discipline that ensures teams seriously execute their actions. For individuals focusing on their own deep work habits, while there may not be a team to hold meetings, this doesn't mean you don't need regular accountability. In many sections of this book, I discuss and suggest weekly review habits, in which you plan for the upcoming week's work. See rule number 4. Throughout my experience with 4DX, I used the weekly review to assess my scoreboard, recall successful weeks, identify what had led to less productive weeks, and most importantly, figure out how to ensure a high score for the upcoming days. This helped me adjust my schedule to meet the needs of the lead measures, allowing me to learn from the process and engage in deeper work. The 4DX framework is based on the fundamental premise that execution is often harder than strategy formulation. After studying hundreds of case studies, the authors identified several core disciplines that seem particularly effective in overcoming this challenge. Therefore, it is no surprise that these principles have the same impact on personal goals when cultivating deep work habits. To conclude, let's revisit my example. As mentioned, when I first approached 4DX, I set the ambitious goal of publishing 5 highly rated peer-reviewed papers in the 2013 to 2014 academic year. This was a bold goal considering I had only published 4 papers the previous year, an achievement I still take pride in. Throughout my 4DX journey, the clarity of the goal, along with the simple and noticeable feedback from my scoreboard, pushed me to an unprecedented level of depth. Looking back, it wasn't because I increased the intensity of my deep work, but rather because I did it consistently. The 4DX habit helped keep my mind focused throughout the year. By the end of the process, I must admit it was an exhausting year, especially since I was also writing this book. However, it turned out to be a compelling testament to the 4DX framework. In the summer of 2014 alone, I had 9 papers approved for publication, double what I had achieved in previous years. Laziness. In a 2012 blog post for the New York Times, essayist and cartoonist Tim Kreider made a very striking introduction about himself. "I'm not busy. I'm the laziest ambitious person I know." Kreider had grown weary of being busy for months, so he expressed this frustration. Here's what he described about this period. "I had quietly started, under work demands, to become busy. Every morning, my inbox was filled with emails requesting things I didn't want to do or dealing with issues I had to solve right at that moment." What was his solution? He would go to what he called his secret base. A place without TV, without the internet. He'd have to bike to the local library if he wanted to go online, where he could escape trivial, seemingly harmless tasks that accumulated over time and could seriously disrupt his deep work habits. Speaking about his retreat, Kreider said, "I still remember the golden marigolds, the stink bugs, and the stars. I read. And finally, for the first time in months, I completed an actual, whole piece of work." The key point to note here is that Kreider wasn't thorough. He didn't run away from the busy world to criticize the complexities of society. His move to the secret base stemmed from the surprising realization that it helped him work more effectively. Here's Kreider's explanation. Laziness is not just a vacation break, nor is it a self-indulgence or a vice. It is as essential to the brain as vitamin D is to the body, and when deprived of it, we suffer greatly. Paradoxically, it is a necessary element for getting work done. Of course, work here doesn't mean superficial tasks. Almost always, the more time you immerse yourself in trivial tasks, the deeper you sink into them. However, as a writer, Kreider cared about deep work, the serious effort required to create meaningful works. He believed that to achieve such endeavors, we need to regularly relax our minds. This strategy advocates for Kreider's advice. Give yourself significant free time to escape the constraints of daily work, creating a paradoxical laziness that is necessary for achieving results. There are many ways to achieve this goal. For example, you can retreat from the world as Kreider did by hiding in his secret base, but not everyone is able to do this. Instead, I want to propose a bold but feasible approach. At the end of the workday, stop worrying about work until the next morning. Don't check your emails after dinner, don't engage in idle chatter, and don't plan to tackle upcoming challenges. Completely cut off any thoughts related to work. If you need more time, extend your workday, but once you stop working, your mind should be fully immersed in golden marigolds, stink bugs, and the stars, just like Kreider. Before I describe some supporting tactics for this strategy, I want to explore why stopping work will actually benefit your ability to produce valuable output. Of course, this is thanks to Tim Kreider's own experience, but we should still take time to understand the science behind the value of rest. A more thorough study has provided 3 compelling explanations for this value as follows. Reason number 1. Rest time supports important thinking. Here is an excerpt from a 2006 article in Science. For hundreds of years, scientific literature has emphasized the benefits of careful deliberation when making decisions. The question here is whether this is always reasonable. Let's assume the answer is no. Hidden within this rather bland statement is a bold claim. The authors of this study, led by Dutch psychologist A.P. Dijksterhuis, argue that in some cases, it's better to let the unconscious mind handle decisions. In other words, actively calculating to make decisions often leads to worse outcomes than simply updating the necessary information and then shifting attention to something else, allowing the subconscious mind to process things. Dijksterhuis' team demonstrated this effect by providing necessary information to participants who were choosing a car to buy. Half of the participants were asked to study the information and make their best decision. The other half were distracted with easy puzzles after reading the information and had to make their decision without consciously thinking about it. In the end, the distracted group made better decisions. This experiment and the introduction of unconscious thought theory, UTT, highlight the different roles conscious and unconscious thinking play in decision-making. On a high level, this theory proposes that for decisions requiring strict application of rules, conscious thinking is essential. For example, if you need to perform a calculation, only your conscious mind can follow arithmetic rules to arrive at an accurate result. On the other hand, for decisions involving large amounts of unclear, ambiguous, and even contradictory information, unconscious thinking is the better choice. UTT hypothesizes that this is because the unconscious mind has more neural pathways, allowing it to process and filter more information and potential solutions than the conscious thinking centers. In this analogy, conscious thinking works like a home calculator, running carefully programmed calculations to narrow down possible solutions, while unconscious thinking acts like Google's vast data centers, where statistical algorithms analyze vast amounts of unstructured data to provide surprisingly useful solutions to complex problems. This study indicates that allowing conscious thought time to rest enables unconscious thinking to tackle the most complex challenges in work. Therefore, rest doesn't necessarily mean reducing the amount of effective working time. Rather, it allows for a diversification of work methods. Reason 2. Rest time helps you recover the energy needed for deep work. A study published in Psychological Science in 2008 described a simple experiment. Participants were divided into 2 groups. One group was asked to walk on a wooded trail in a botanical garden near Ann Arbor, Michigan. The other group walked in the busy city center. Both groups were tasked with completing a countdown task. The results showed that the group walking in nature performed 20% better on the task. The advantage of walking in nature persisted even in the following week when the researchers switched locations. It wasn't the people that made the difference, but whether they had the opportunity to walk in the woods. It turns out, this study is one of many confirming the attention restoration theory, ART, which asserts that spending time in nature can help improve people's ability to focus. This theory, proposed by psychologists Rachel Kaplan and Stephen Kaplan at the University of Michigan in the 1980s, and later expanded by Stephen Kaplan with Mark Berman and John Jonida in 2008, is based on the concept of directed attention fatigue. ART focuses on what it calls directed attention, a limited energy source that, when depleted, makes it harder to concentrate. This concept can be compared to the limited energy reserves described by Baumeister, which we discussed in the introduction to this rule. The 2008 study showed that walking through busy city streets required participants to use their directed attention, as they had to navigate complex tasks such as deciding when to cross the street safely or avoiding slow-moving groups of tourists blocking the sidewalk. After about 50 minutes of such concentrated navigation, their attention waned. On the other hand, walking in nature provides inherently captivating stimuli that help restore your focus. For example, consider sunsets. These stimuli elicit attention modestly, creating an opportunity to replenish focusing mechanisms. In other words, when walking in nature, you don't need to actively direct your attention because there are few distractions, like navigating through crowds on a busy street. And instead, You are exposed to interesting stimuli that allow your mind to be expansive and relaxed without having to focus. This state further reinforces directed attention, and participants showed improved focus after 50 minutes of such restorative experiences. Of course, you might argue that being outdoors to watch a sunset would put people in a better mood, helping them perform tasks more smoothly. But in more challenging conditions, researchers repeated the experiment in the harsh winter of Ann Arbor. Walking outdoors in bone-chilling cold didn't improve people's mood, yet they still performed tasks well. Importantly, we see that art's benefits extend beyond the natural environment. The core mechanism of this theory is that you can restore your ability to direct attention by taking a break. Walking in nature always offers that kind of restorative feeling, but there are plenty of other relaxing activities that can also provide similar, inherently captivating stimuli and don't require focus. Casual conversations with friends, listening to music while cooking, playing with children, or running all can help restore attention in the same way a walk in nature can. On the other hand, if you continue to disrupt your evening by checking and responding to emails, or spend a few extra hours after dinner catching up on work to meet deadlines, you are actively controlling the attention center. Even if these activities only take a little time, they can prevent you from reaching a deeper level of relaxation that restores attention. Only when you're confident that your work is completed for the day can you convince your brain to temporarily rest and recharge for the next day. In other words, trying to squeeze in just a bit more work in the evening may reduce your effectiveness the following day, making it impossible to get as much done as if you had respected the rest period. Reason 3. Work that evening downtime can replace is often not important. The final argument for maintaining a clear endpoint to your workday requires us to understand a bit about Anders Ericsson, the father of deliberate practice theory. Recall from Part 1 that deliberate practice is a focused, systematic effort to improve a specific skill. It is necessary to enhance proficiency in any field. As I've mentioned, deep work and deliberate practice are relatively overlapping concepts. The idea here is that we can make deliberate practice a general goal for high cognitive demand tasks. In his 1993 paper, The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, Ericsson summarized what research has shown about an individual's cognitive capabilities in demanding work. Ericsson noted that, for novices, people can only focus intensely for about 1 hour per day, while experts might extend this to 4 hours. But this is rare. For example, one study examined the habitual routines of a group of elite violinists trained at the University of the Arts in Berlin. The study found that these skilled violinists spent an average of about 3.5 hours per day in deliberate practice, usually divided into 2 distinct periods. Less experienced players would spend less time in deep concentration. These results suggest that the capacity for deep work on a given day is limited. If you are mindful of your schedule, for example, using the productivity strategies described in Rule Number 4, you should focus your deep work efforts during the daytime. In the evening, you'll likely exceed your threshold for deep, effective work. Therefore, any tasks you perform in the evening are unlikely to be the kind of activities that contribute meaningfully to your career. Instead, your efforts will likely be limited to trivial tasks of low value, performed at a slow pace and with minimal energy expenditure. In other words, by temporarily letting go of evening work, you're unlikely to miss out on anything important. Implementing the strategy, a clear boundary for the workday. These 3 reasons provide strong support for the overarching strategy of maintaining a clear end to your workday. Let's summarize with a few practical steps to implement this process. To successfully apply this strategy, you must first commit to the idea that once the workday is over, no career-related concerns, no matter how small, should intrude on the attention you need to give to other parts of your life. This might include activities such as checking emails or browsing work-related websites. In either case, even a brief intrusion can lead to greater distraction and undermine the effectiveness of your downtime for an extended period. For example, most people are familiar with the habit of glancing at email notifications on Saturday morning, which will linger in your thoughts throughout the rest of the weekend. Another crucial commitment for success with this strategy is adhering to a strict rest routine once work has ended, to maximize the chances of success. Specifically, this routine must ensure that any unfinished tasks, goals, or projects are reviewed, and for each item, you must confirm that 1. You have a plan for completing it, and 2. It has been placed somewhere accessible so that you can return to it when needed. This process is no different from an algorithm with a series of steps to follow. Once completed, come up with a phrase that signals the workday is done. I often end the ritual by saying, "Done." While this final step may seem trivial, it provides a simple cue that you should let go of work-related thoughts for the rest of the day. To make this more concrete, I'll describe the steps of my own closing ritual, which I first developed during my PhD dissertation writing and have kept up, in one form or another, ever since. The first thing I do is check my inbox one last time to ensure that there's nothing urgent before wrapping up for the day. Then, I take any tasks still on my mind or previously outlined and convert them into an official task list. I use Google Docs to store my task list so I can access it anytime, anywhere. When I open the list, I quickly skim all the tasks and then look at the upcoming days in my calendar. These actions are meant to ensure that I won't forget any pressing work or important deadlines. After finishing this ritual, I use this information to make a rough plan for the next day. Then, I say, "Time to stop," and all work-related thoughts are considered complete for the day. The concept of a rest ritual may initially seem extreme, but this is also due to the Zeigarnik effect. This effect, named after the experimental work of Bluma Zeigarnik, a psychologist in the early 20th century, highlights the ability of unfinished tasks to dominate our attention. From this, we know that if you stop whatever task you're doing at 5 p.m. and declare, "I'm done for today," you'll find it difficult to detach from thoughts related to work because the unfinished tasks will linger in your mind, just as in Zeigarnik's experiments, and they will continue to attract your attention throughout the evening, an uneven battle where the odds are usually not in our favor. At first, this challenge may seem difficult to overcome. Any person who does continuous intellectual work may find themselves constantly burdened with unfinished tasks. Wouldn't it be nice to experience the feeling that everything has been taken care of? Fortunately, we don't need to complete a task to get it out of our mind. The solution to this problem was provided by psychologists Roy Baumeister and E.J. Masacampo, authors of the intriguing paper, "Consider It Done." They began their research by replicating the Zeigarnik effect on selected subjects, by assigning tasks and then interrupting their progress, and discovered that they could significantly reduce the impact of the effect by having the subjects plan to complete the interrupted task right after it was halted. The study notes, specifically planning to complete a goal not only facilitates its completion, but can also free up cognitive resources for other concerns. The rest ritual described earlier also contributes to this strategy of overcoming the Zeigarnik effect. While it doesn't force you to create a detailed plan for every task on your list, which would be quite a burden, this ritual requires you to stay on top of each item on your general task list, reviewing them before planning for the next day. This ritual ensures that no task is overlooked. Tasks are reviewed daily and addressed at the appropriate time. In other words, your mind will be freed from the need to keep track of all tasks at all times, because the rest ritual has taken on that responsibility. The rest ritual may seem annoying because it requires an additional 10 to 15 minutes at the end of your workday, and sometimes even more time than that, but it is a necessary condition for escaping the systemic inefficiency that was previously created. In my experience, it takes about 1 or 2 weeks to form this habit. This is also the time needed for your mind to trust the ritual, and for you to genuinely start freeing yourself from work-related thoughts in the evening. Once you get used to this ritual, it will become a fixed habit in your life. So much so that if you don't perform it, you'll feel uneasy. I have spent decades studying psychology, and all my research leads to one conclusion. The brain, when regularly rested, improves the quality of deep work. When working, work hard. When you're done, be done. The average response time to emails may be affected, but you will be compensated many times over through the large amount of truly important work accomplished during the day because you will have replenished your energy better than your colleagues who have exhausted theirs.